Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In this video, I want to hopefully clarify, because I get a lot of questions on this from students, the concept of synergistic dominance. Now, relatively simple to understand, but I wanted to just to make sure that maybe I can provide a little bit more clarity, not just in its definition, but in how we use it, or it's used in general, just in resistance training and flexibility training. Now, this is page 443. Now, this also is in the flexibility training concepts, or chapter 14, which is a critically important chapter when it comes to the testing. But normally the question on synergistic dominance is how exactly does it happen? Why does it happen? And what are the results of it, depending on the muscle groups that we're talking about? So synergistic dominance, just in general, I mean, you just got to look at the first word, synergistic. So that would simply mean assisting with. So we have what are known as synergists, or synergistic muscles, in pretty much every joint of the body. So if you've gone through, you understand most of the previous chapters that you've read through, you'll understand some of the concepts known as the prime movers. You have antagonistic muscles, agonists, right? Agonists are, so it's a good idea to know the base terminology before you even get into this idea of synergistic dominance. So agonists are those muscles that are considered the prime mover for a particular movement pattern over a joint, just as a for instance. So if I'm doing dumbbell curls, right, the whole point of dumbbell curls is to work the biceps. So the bicep in this case, during this movement, this particular movement, is the agonist. Now, here's one of the interesting things that we get confused with. If you're talking about agonist and antagonist, we're talking about the muscles. On the other hand, on the biomechanical kinesiological side of the house, so to speak, there's the concept of just human movement. And if we look at the elbow joint and don't necessarily look at the bicep or the tricep, the elbow joint goes through flexion and extension. So you have to sort of differentiate the terminology based on the concepts that you're trying to focus on. If we're talking about muscular contractions and the muscles, what muscles we're using, what muscles are opposing a particular muscle, this is where the terms agonist comes in, antagonist comes in. So the biceps is the agonist when we are doing this movement. If I'm holding a dumbbell, you'll notice that I am not only flexing, but I'm also extending the elbow joint. So the biceps are the primary flexor at the elbow, but the elbow goes through flexion and extension. Get it? The same movement. Look at the movement pattern. So kinesiologically, flexion, extension. If all I talk about is kinesiology, the kinesiological terminology, it's just the joint movement, irrespective of the muscles. It's just that the joint moves through flexion and extension. Once I add muscular activity to it, now I have to be specific as to whether or not the muscles that work over a joint are the agonist or the antagonist, based on essentially the line of pull, or where the force is coming from. If I'm holding a dumbbell and the force of gravity is pulling down and I pull up this way, the agonist is the bicep. If, however, I'm holding a cable and I'm pushing down with the force vector going up, right, because the cable is pulling my arm up, now the agonist is the tricep. Okay, so you got to keep that in mind. We got to differentiate between the muscular system, agonist, antagonist, synergist, right, prime movers, versus the kinesiological function of the joint. And you got to separate those two so there's no confusion. This is quite often in the explanation where there is confusion. So keep that in mind now. Every joint in your body, your elbow, your shoulder, your hips, if you understand the muscles that work over all those particular joints, and again, this is one of those, just one of those things you've got to know. You don't have to memorize 100 muscles. You do have to memorize the basic global musculature, right? Those prime movers that move the main joints of the body, the ankles, the knee, the LPHC, the shoulders, the elbow, I guess if you want to say the wrist, whatever. But the point is that you got to know those primary movers that are on all sides of the joint, right? So in the elbow joint, what do you have? And I'm using that just as a simple example. At the elbow, you've got three main flexor muscles, and you have basically one main extensor. That's only four muscles you need to kind of memorize around the elbow. Around the pelvis, it's the hip flexors, the hip extensors. You've got the abductors, the adductors, you got the rotators, you got the the pelvis movement of the pelvis, those muscles that are responsible for, anterior, posterior pelvic tilting, lateral movement, this and that. So it may sound like that, but it's not. It's not a lot. You just got to know those main muscles. And of course, that's what NASM is kind of helping you with, is basically telling you got to memorize the muscles at least. Now let's move to how this actually works in the real world when we're talking about issues related to muscle imbalances. And that's really what they're getting into. And you would have already seen the human movement system review, because they've already gone over this muscle imbalances, because again, I'm in chapter 14 specifically, and this is where I've had some questions just recently related to, well, I know they spoke about it earlier in the textbook, but specifically I wanted, I've had students ask me, so explain that altered reciprocal inhibition. That's one concept, but here today, synergistic dominance. And from a flexibility perspective, essentially, it's, as NASM says, it's a neuromuscular, right, the nervous system and the muscular system phenomenon that occurs when synergists, i.e., the muscles that are not the prime mover of a kinesiological movement, they help and assist with that kinesiological movement. So you have muscles, or a muscle that is the primary, meaning it generates the greatest level of force or tension to produce a particular kinesiological movement. So they give you the case here, for instance, and it's good for any joint of your pelvis, which is generally the one where we see problems. Honestly, it's going to be the LPHC, lumbopelvic hip complex. So the gluteus maximus, right, is the primary hip extensor muscle, but it is not the only hip extensor muscle. Get the idea? So if you do some testing on enough people, you'll find out, you'll realize that generally it's understood that the primary extensor of the hip is the gluteus maximus. However, like I said, there's other muscles that assist and help with that. Those muscles are known as synergists. In the helpful hint box, they actually tell you, imagine a basketball team, right? So you got your primary player, Michael, right? Michael Jordan. So that's the guy that is doing all the work. He's hitting all the shots. And then you have the other guys around him that, he'll hit 50 points a game, 60 points a game, and some of the other guys will hit 10, 12, 15, or whatever the case is. Get it? Primary action, primary muscle causing the action, and then the assisting muscles that now help with that same kinesiological movement, synergistic, so they are helping, right? Syn, S-Y-N, means with. So you have the agonistic muscles, right? Agonists, those are the ones that are producing the movement. And under the broad category of agonist or agonists, right, you have prime movers and synergists. It's the best way to think about it. In the case of the pelvis and the hip, obviously there's a lot of muscles in there, and depending on the position of certain joints, you can have other muscles that'll act as synergists as well. The simplest way then to understand this is that in the case of hip extension, the prime mover that produces hip extension is the gluteus maximus, with assistance from synergistically from the hamstring group, biceps femoris, semi-tendinosus, semi-membranosus, because all three of those attach to the pelvic tuberosity. They are going to assist with moving the femur right in through extension. So primary glutes, gluteus maximus, synergists are going to be the hamstrings. Well, then what is synergistic dominance? If you've got the hamstrings acting as synergists, then now the second word, dominance, meaning that the prime mover, which should be the dominant mover for that particular kinesiological motion, is not doing its job. Of course, the question is why, and we'll get into that in a second. So now what you have are these secondary, the synergists now coming into play to provide the majority of force or tension development to get the same action or movement. In this case, let's say the hip. The real question is why, and as NASM will explain to you earlier as well as here, the reason is simply because that prime mover has been sort of deactivated in its capabilities to produce enough tension. We call that lengthened. You could use the word hypotonic, although they don't generally use it, but you will hear the word underactive versus overactive. And we know that in the case of the overactive, underactive muscles, you got to memorize these particular muscles at the particular joints. So now you have this hypotonic or underactive or lengthened muscle, and that would be the glutes in this case. So the primary mover, the gluteus maximus, for whatever reason. Now it could, and generally it is because the antagonistic muscles or the hip flexors, piriformis, the iliacus, the rectus femoris, those guys, for whatever reason, are overactive, and they're pulling and then forcing their opposing muscle, the glutes in this case. They're forcing that muscle to kind of give way, and that muscle lengthens and becomes underactive. And that's where this whole neuromuscular phenomenon occurs from. So is it from that? I don't know. There could be an injury. It could be other reasons. But the general reason for the average person is that the hip flexors in this case are overactive because they've been shortened, because I sit all the time, right? And because you sit all the time, your muscles now actually will start to shorten to the length that they are put into, and will remain like that. And that causes what we call the altered reciprocal inhibition and some of the other terms that you've already learned. But again, for synergistic dominance, somebody's got to come in and score all those points. If the glutes aren't going to do it, provide enough tension, then the synergistic muscles will. In this case, it's generally going to be the hamstring. So the basic concept, again, is that underactive prime movers, for whatever reason, they are underactive, simply cannot do the job needed at the joint, and therefore the synergistic or other helping muscles now will become more active to support that underactive prime mover. This, of course, as you read through, I hope it makes sense now. This causes some big problems, especially at the hips and the pelvic region, because the hamstrings are not meant to do the job of the glutes. They are there to help and assist. Now, take one step, it's kind of a sidebar, into the real world. Now, in athletics, this could be a huge problem. And you've probably seen this 100-meter, 200-meter athletes getting a hamstring pull. That should never happen. Something is awry, and the trainer should have known, obviously, that this individual, this athlete, probably had some issues related to the very things we're talking about. Remember, like an athlete, like a 100-meter sprinter, they have to have all cylinders firing at the same time. Everything needs to be functioning because they are at such a high level of muscular output during like a sprint. And that's where I find this all very interesting, because all you got to do is have a little bit of an issue with a prime mover, develop synergistic dominance, and those hamstrings will pop. And they will pull because they're under too much tension. They should not be under that level of tension. The glutes should be providing that's what the glutes are designed for. Remember, the glutes, very compact, relatively small tendon attachments, very strong power output. They can handle the force of a top level like an Olympic athlete. The hamstrings, not so much. They're not really designed, really well designed to act as a real heavy power output type of muscle group at the hips. They can do it, and they do it, but their main focus is at the knee. Get it? So, along with really strong, powerful glutes, the hamstrings can provide this extra power and bang to that locomotion when when it is created a synergistic dominance effect. They could pull. So that's synergistic dominance. I hope this was helpful. And if it did provide some clarity, please write that in the comments section or just write that you understood the video itself. If you do want full access to the NASM exam study materials that we provide, please click on the link in the description box below. As always, have a great week. We'll see you next week. Thanks.